So today we're going to talk about police-community relations and legitimacy. Those are two separate but interrelated concepts that you need to understand. Both have to do with how people view the police. And I think this is a very relevant topic given George Floyd and Breonna Taylor and all the events that led up to that. Please know that since we're going to be talking about this very touchy subject, that at no time I mean to devalue anything, right? I'm going to try to be as fair and as balanced and as objective as possible. So let's talk about different racial groups and ethnic groups and cultural groups and how they have how their relationship with the police have existed throughout time. One thing that we know is that white people tend to have better relationships with the police. Now, yes, you'll have some ignorant people saying, well, more white people die by the hands of the police. Yeah, but there are more white people. So, yeah, of course. But when you look at percentages, right? Yes, there are more white people in prisons, but only 12% of the general population of people in the United States are black. But in federal prisons, the black population can go up to about 40% sometimes, depending on when or where you're studying it. Right? So there is disparities. Why are there more black people in prison? And why do black people have a higher chance of interacting with the police than white people? You realize that the police, when they assess your behavior, when they assess your extra legal behavior, meaning, look, they might see you committed a crime, and that is defined, like how to behave is defined for them through departmental policies, through administrative rulemaking. But it's the extra legal things that also influence their behavior that they might not be overtly aware of, right? Like looking a man in the eye and giving him a firm handshake, right? That, looking a man in the eye, giving him a firm handshake, that's a white people patriarchy norm. Now, whether you're sitting there rolling your eyes at me, oh my gosh, it is, right? But other cultures, right, might show respect by not looking for someone in the eye, or by remaining silent because they don't want to come off as someone who puts all their business out there. So a police officer, when they see a white person who grew up in white culture, right, who learned that when someone who's in a position of authority shows up, you look them in the eye and you should give them a firm handshake. You say, yes, sir, yes, ma'am. They will see you as being respectful and treat you differently, whether they're aware of it or not. As opposed to someone whose cultural values might say, I show respect by keeping my head down, by being silent, by only answering the questions that I'm asked. And someone who grew up, a police officer who's assessing that behavior through the white middle-class patriarchal value system, might see that as disrespect and then treat that person differently. And so when you survey people of different ethnic and racial, socioeconomic status backgrounds, you'll see that white middle class and upper class people would have much more pleasant encounters with the police and have a much different understanding of the role of the police and their experiences. So let's talk about the difference between race and ethnicity. I found this really cool graph or chart or whatever on Google Images, and I think it's really cool. So oftentimes we sort of mix race and ethnicity, especially in the United States, right? Because of the vibrant Hispanic community that we have. But that the Hispanic community, being Hispanic is an ethnicity and it's not a race, but we sometimes sort of blur those lines. Race are major biological features like skin color or other facial features, right? That you can't necessarily change unless you get like the surgery that Michael Jackson got, I guess. Ethnicity is something that you identify with, right? Like my race is white, but my ethnicity is Afrikaner, right? It's a type of Dutch immigrant that lived in South Africa, right? Your race might be white, but your ethnicity might be Hispanic. Your race might be black, but your ethnicity might also be Hispanic. So think of race as some things that you probably cannot change, while ethnicity is things that you can change based on what you identify with culturally. But people seldom change their ethnicity. You can typically tell what someone's ethnicity is by the way they dress, by the way they body language they use, by cultural features, right? And sometimes ethnicity would be connected to language and religion, right? Like, so when I lived in the Washington, D.C. area, so when I moved as an immigrant to the Washington, D.C. area, right, they put me in these English as a second language classes, which frankly to me was kind of offensive because I had learned English quite well in South Africa. But nonetheless, I was put in these classes, and most of my friends then were also immigrants. So a lot of Arab, Persian, El Salvadorian, and some Korean people I became friends with. In addition to your regular white folk that you find there, but I never knew that there was an ethnic difference between Arabs and Persians, right? So your Arabs, like my Arab friend Omar, he was from Jordan, and then I had another Arab friend. His name was Alex. He was from Egypt. But then I had a Persian friend named Fuad, who was from Iran, and then another Persian friend who was from Afghanistan. And I never knew. I just sort of saw them all kind of ignorantly as Middle Eastern, right? And maybe you could classify that as their race, but culturally they were very different. They spoke different languages. Persians typically speak a form of Farsi, while Arabs speak forms of Arabic, right? And that's another thing. I remember calling my friend Omar, "Hey man, you're Arabic," or whatever. And he was like, "No, I'm Arab. I speak Arabic." And I was like, "Whoa, I'm sorry," right? So there were major differences between these people who I thought were the same, right? Ignorantly thought were the same. But that was one of the good things. One of the things I appreciate of being sort of put into these English as second language courses is that I got to really experience other people's cultures, because I became very good friends with these people, and I went to their homes. I ate their food. I learned their customs. I became very good friends with them, right? And it was interesting. Some of those friends of mine never really assimilated to American culture, while others of us did, right? I was one of the ones who wanted to fit in with Americans, so I took those extra steps to. Others just sort of let it happen slowly over time, and then another one, you couldn't tell that they had been living in the United States for almost 20 years now. But nonetheless, those are the major differences, right? So in the United States, what are some big racial and ethnic groups that we need to talk about within the context of policing? So we have the, obviously, black people. When we think about police-community relations, your mind immediately goes to the frayed relationship between the police and the black community. And we can talk for ages about it. Here's the thing. No matter, you get some of these people who are like, well, everything's equal now. We had a black president, blah. Yes, we have had a black president, but we've had 40-something white presidents. You know what I mean? So you've had one black president. Woo! That doesn't make everything fixed and equal and even now. This is a really tiny slide. That guy right there is Lewis Hamilton. Those of you who don't know who that is, he's a Formula One racing driver. Actually, he is this year going to become. He's on track to become the most successful Formula One racing driver by many metrics. And guess what? He is the only and first black Formula One racing driver. But he has he's been an amazing voice of the Black Lives Matter movement in Europe, and he's an English fella, and yeah, he actually got the entire Formula One people to, at the beginning of each race, take a knee and stand in solidarity with the Black Lives Matter movement. But nonetheless, let's talk about the difference between discrimination and disparity. Discrimination is when it's a process where disparities are a outcome, meaning that discrimination can lead to disparities. All right, so discrimination is when someone is treated differently because of extra legal factors. Maybe their socioeconomic status, maybe their race, maybe their ethnicity. And so different types of discrimination, like systematic discrimination, institutional discrimination, individual discrimination, all of these things can lead to different disparities, right? And unfortunately, especially when it comes to the black community, there's this extra element because of the relationship because of the context of the black community, right? The black people, again, are mostly descendants of slaves, right? So there was this socioeconomic oppression in addition to just the pure prejudice and racial oppression, right? So a lot of the disadvantages that black people unfortunately have to deal with in this country are a result of both, of racism and of classism, are a part of the fact that most police officers are white men, right? And so inadvertently, and sometimes overtly, but not, I say most of the time it's inadvertently, they judge you without knowing according to their white people standards. And then there's also the socioeconomic thing where you don't have the same opportunity to get away with crime as maybe a middle or upper class white person. So what are some other factors that influence public opinion of the police? Well, obviously race, right? We find that most people like the police. Most black people like the police. Most Hispanic people, most Asian people, most white people like the police. But when you look at people who don't have a lot of confidence in the police, you see the minority members have less, right? Only about 75% of black people like or trust the police, right? Poorer people have lower confidence in the police. Again, socioeconomic status. That's where a lot of crime occurs because of many reasons. There's many social disorganization reasons. You can use a strain theory to explain it. But if the police are in your neighborhood busting people who you don't think deserve to go to jail, right, you're going to have lower confidence in them. So then also where you live, your gender, your level of education. And then you have controversial incidents, right? George Floyd, that had a major impact on people's perceptions and of police legitimacy, right? So how can the police change the view that people have of them? How can the police make people more confident in them? Well, what do they prioritize, right? What do the police seem concerned about? Do they just like busting low-level things, or are they going after the real crime, right? And this is where community-oriented policing and problem-oriented policing can come in to help this. This is why the police need to stop resisting science and embrace it, because it'll make their lives easier. It'll cause them to not have a situation where people are asking to defund them. But if they want to continue to be cantankerous about it, well, then we'll defund them. How competent do they seem, right? I'd say in America, our police is very competent. They're just extremely, extremely resistant to science. Can you depend on them, right? And again, if you live in a neighborhood where the police are constantly pulling young black men out of that neighborhood for smoking weed or, low-level drug dealing, are you going to have a lot of confidence in them? Or is it going to seem like people are just plucking all of the potential out of your community and putting them in jail? Now, a lot of this isn't the police's fault. It's the law that allows these things, which is why you people need to go out and vote. Legalize marijuana, right? Lower the amount of the sentences for drugs like cocaine and crack. Those sentences need to go down. Change probable cause laws. Change use of force laws. Vote in people on a local level. Do the police show us respect? Do they understand what respect means in my cultural context? This is why it's so important to hire more minority and female officers, so that you have officers that can show that understand the plight of the community with whom they're communicating, so that they can also help educate the white male officers in the department, so that they can understand how to communicate and how best to show respect. People's perceptions of the police depend on factors like age, socioeconomic status, education, race and ethnicity, and where you live, right? Some people might just have a bunch of duds as police officers where they live, and that might impact the way they feel about them. Sources of problems can often be how much law enforcement you see, what people are being arrested for, how often you see someone being arrested for something that you deem as BS. Does it feel like you're being racially profiled? Is the police being active with the way they enforce traffic? Does your state have a fleeing felon rule? To what extent can the police use deadly force? When you call the police, do they show up on time or not? So how do we improve police-community relations? Well, you can reduce the amount of force that's being used. You can make it more representative. We can write policies that say exactly when you can use how much force, instead of leaving it up to the police agencies to come up with them themselves. The police can handle citizen complaints with more transparency and rigor. The police can hire more minority members so that their police force represents their community. If you like in Ferguson, Missouri, one of the major issues is that almost all the cops there were white, and they were policing a predominantly black jurisdiction. Can you maybe see how that would add racial tensions to things? Having more people who look like you, understand you in the police makes you feel more comfortable about them. Special programs, having community units, ride-alongs. Me and a colleague of mine are studying the impacts of of ride-alongs on people's perceptions of the police. And what we're finding is that if you do a ride-along and the police officer is friendly during that ride-along to you, it significantly changes your perceptions of the police. You make the police seem more fair, they become more sympathetic towards the police. Right? And ride-along programs are cheap. Because you open up the person to the realities of police work. And you realize that the police deal with a lot of unreasonable people all the time. And so that then shapes the way they want to do their job. Right? It's like when you're a professor and your students just constantly complain at you. Right? You're going to get tired of helping them. Especially when you're actually trying hard. So yeah, those special programs will help make everything, smooth things over a bit. But the police have to get to a point where they understand the history of things.